Hello, everyone. I hope you are having a great day. Today's message is brought to you by Pastor Jeff Rockey.
All right, we got a lot of ground to cover today. And we're going to be in multiple passages at different points. So if you just want to make note of where those passages are, none of them are going to be on the wall today. It just wasn't worth throwing them up and flashing them that quickly. So, but we're going to start actually in Exodus. In Exodus, I don't know if you know much about the book of Exodus, but in the book of Exodus, Moses spends a lot of time up on a mountain. That's kind of the brief, that's the most basic summary of Exodus you can get. He spends a lot of time up on the mountain. And while he's up there, he's getting these instructions from God. So while he's there, God does a whole bunch of things. He sets the parameters for how the Israelites are supposed to live, right? These are the rules that I want you to follow, and Moses has to write all these down and bring them back to the people, right? So he sets the parameters for how to live. He sets and it's not just the parameters of how to live. He sets the dimensions of the tabernacle. This is what I want you to build. This is how I want you to build it. This is the size it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be so many cubits by so many cubits, on and on. And he gives these very detailed instructions of what the Israelites are supposed to have and how they're supposed to live. And he gives them also their marching orders, quite literally, their marching orders. He says, whenever the cloud moves, I need you to move with them. And I don't want you to just kind of do this in a helter-skelter fashion. Like, it's not just, we're going. He's like, no, we have to make sure that everything is done in order. So this tribe goes first, and this tribe goes second, and this tribe goes third. And he tells them the exact order in which the tribes are supposed to be in line as they go and follow where God wants them to go. So throughout Exodus, God is giving them all these instructions of what they're supposed to do. And also in the midst of all that, God gives Moses the Big Ten, which is, by the way, why the Big Ten is the best, because God gave them the Big Ten. So it's just so you know. So he gives them the Big Ten, right? These are the commandments that you're supposed to follow. And they're, again, instructions on what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to do it. And one of those 10 commandments is going to be our focus for this morning. One of the 10 commandments is remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. In this case, as we look at this, the Sabbath is a noun. It's a particular day of the week, right? Just like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday are nouns, the Sabbath is a noun. And according to God's instructions, if you were to read that in the book of Exodus, as you look at that, there's a little bit of an explanation underneath that commandment, right? Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. And then he goes and kind of outlines what that means. And as he outlines what that means in God's instructions, he says the Sabbath is set aside as holy. Okay? The Sabbath is set aside as a holy day. It has a specific purpose. It has a sacred purpose. Right? It's not just another day. There's a sacredness to it. God has set it aside for something specific, something holy. And he even tells him, he says, listen, you can, those 6 days, do your work. Do your work those 6 days. But on the 7th day, the Sabbath day, I need you to keep that holy, right? So he says, don't work. Now listen, there's a lot of conversation. There was a lot of conversation. There's still a lot of conversation as to what does that really mean? What are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do? How far can you go? How far can we push the limit? Right? Where's the line that we can go up to here? We can, and the Pharisees, right? They had that down to a science. In fact, so maybe you know this, maybe you don't know this, but they had it defined out to these different rules, and they literally would put a tent peg outside of their house and tie a rope to it and tie that rope around their waist, because if you walked so many steps, then that was work. But if you kept it within that amount of, not going outside of that steps, then you were fine. So they would tie it around their waist so they would only go so far so that they wouldn't go outside of that realm and work. crazy, right? All right. So, but they didn't want to disobey God, and that was the whole idea. Like, let's not disobey Him. So we're going to make all these rules that we have to follow in order to keep the Sabbath and not work on it. So again, God says, do your work 6 days, but don't work on the Sabbath. This Sabbath is a period of time to be observed and acknowledged, right? Sun up to sundown. That's what God said in the instructions. Now, traditionally, this was a Saturday. In more recent times, if you can call 1,200 years recent, in more recent times, it's become Sunday in most Christian traditions, right? So regardless, so we usually choose Sunday as our Sabbath, as our holy day, and so we gather together on Sunday to observe these traditions and these different ways of bringing of recognizing the holiness of this day. Right? But regardless of whichever day you choose, God says one day a week is to be set aside as the Sabbath day. So again, when you're doing this, it's kind of a noun, but we've been talking about spiritual disciplines, and spiritual disciplines are verbs, right? They're things that we do. It's action in the portion of this, right? So when we talk about Sabbath, when we need to observe Sabbath as a spiritual discipline, it's kind of like, how do you mix a noun and a verb together in order to make this happen, right? So again, just a little bit of information for you. The root of the word Hebrew, literally, the root of the Hebrew word for Sabbath literally means to rest. It literally means to rest. Okay? So even within that word, we find a verb. Genesis 1 records creation, and it tells us that on the seventh day, God rested, or literally, He took Sabbath. God took Sabbath on the seventh day, and He rested from the work that He had done. So again, while Sabbath is a noun, it works and functions more like a verb, which is important for us. So we're going to look at what it means to Sabbath and how to practice it as a spiritual discipline. Again, as we've been looking at these spiritual disciplines over the past several weeks, I made it pretty clear that the purpose of spiritual disciplines is it's a practice so that we will look more like Jesus. It's an exercise that we literally like follow or step into or try to do so that we will look more like Jesus. That's the goal of any spiritual discipline, is just to look more like Jesus. Right? And so if that is the case, then we should be able to see these disciplines at work in Jesus' life, because He set the example for us so that we will know whether we look like Him or not. So in all of these things, we can go back to Scripture. No matter what spiritual discipline we're talking about, we can go back to Scripture, and more specifically, we can go back to the Gospels and look and see what was it that Jesus did, and how did he exercise this discipline? How did He practice these things so that we can look more like Him, so that we can map it out and say, well, these are the things that Jesus did. These are the things that this is what it looked like. And so if we can do those things like Him, we will look more like Jesus. So that's where we're going to start. We're just going to look and see, what did Jesus say or do in regards to the Sabbath. And Jesus talked a lot about the Sabbath, by the way. Probably not in the ways that the Pharisees wanted Him to, but He did talk a lot about the Sabbath. Right? So I'm just going to give you some verses, and I'm going to tell you, and I'm just going to read those verses for you. Again, there's several of them here where it talks about what Jesus did or how He responded to the Sabbath. All right, so Luke 4:16. Luke 4:16. It says, Jesus went to Nazareth, where He had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day, He went into the synagogue, as was His custom. Okay? Luke 4:16. You're going to find a similar thread running through all these things. Luke 13:10. Again, Luke 13:10 says this: on the Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues. Okay? And then it goes on and talks about that just a little bit. But on that Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in the synagogues. Mark 1:21 says, they went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. Picking up a common thread through this so far. Mark 6, verse 2. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. Matthew 12 is a little bit different. In Matthew 12, and we're going to look at a similar verse out of the Gospel of Mark, Mark chapter 2. But in Matthew 12, Jesus and his disciples, it's a Sabbath, and Jesus and his disciples are walking along, right? And they're hungry, and they're walking beside a wheat field. And so some of his disciples and Jesus, they reach over, they grab some of the wheat, they kind of, rub the chaff off of it, and they began to eat the wheat. Well, this, by the Pharisees' definition, was work. This is work. You don't do that. That's work. So they start to complain about the disciples, right? They pick and verse 9. Then when we get to verse 9, it says, going from that place on that day, on that Sabbath, he went into their synagogue. Again, we're going to look at Mark's version of that story here in just a little bit. But I wanted you to see those passages of Scripture so that you could see that Jesus' practice on the Sabbath day was to go to the synagogue. It was to go to the synagogue and participate in what was going on there. So we see him going to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and he was going, and if you follow the stories, he went there for multiple reasons. He went there, honestly, he went there to learn. Right? That's where they find him. Well, I have to be about my Father's business. And that's where he spent time with the Father, it was in the synagogue. And that's where he learned from the Father. I don't know if he learned from anybody else, any of the rabbis who were there, but he learned from the Father in that place. Right? So he went there to learn. He went there to teach. On multiple occasions, it says when Jesus came to the synagogue, they gave him the scrolls so that he would do the teaching. Or they invited him to do that teaching in the midst of that. So he went to learn, he went to teach, he went to worship, right? He went to participate in what was going on, in the songs that were being sung, in the rituals that were taking place, in the different things that were going on the synagogue, on the Sabbath. Whatever those rituals were, Jesus was taking part of that. So he went there to worship. He went there for community. He went with his disciples. He said, come on, these are our people. This is where we're going. And he also went to the synagogue on the Sabbath, honestly, to rest in the Father. Right? On the day of rest, that's where he found rest, was in the Father. And so he would go to the synagogue, and while everything was going on, and in the midst of the worship, and I don't think it was a whole lot different, but while the incense was rising, Jesus' prayers were rising, and his conversation with the Father took place, and that conversation with the Father brought him rest and peace. Now, that's what happened when he went to the synagogue, but that isn't all he did on the Sabbath. Right? According to some of the verses that we looked at and some of the other verses that I looked at, on the Sabbath day, Jesus took walks and hung out with his friends. Right? I mean, he was just hanging out with the disciples. And they were just walking along, and like I said, picking up wheat and having a conversation while they ate. Hang out. Sometimes on the Sabbath, as we read in different places, he sometimes would go off by himself just to be with the Father. I mean, this is, again, I don't have any particular place that I can point you to show this, but I don't think it would have been that unusual for him to go to the synagogue and then just kind of go off by himself and reflect over the things that he had read and the things that he had heard and the things that he had spent. So just to spend time between him and the Father and have no other distractions around. Sometimes on the Sabbath, like with the grabbing of the wheat and eating that, sometimes he got into trouble on the Sabbath by healing people, by delivering them, by doing the things that the Pharisees said, no, this defined his work. So he got himself in trouble sometimes. I have a certain image of Jesus, and I don't know whether he went out of his way to find those people and annoy them, or but it always seemed to be that whenever he was doing those things, they were always around and would try to catch him in the midst of that. But sometimes he went out of his way, maybe to just kind of make a point about what the Sabbath is. My point in all of this is that Jesus interacted with the Sabbath as both the noun and the verb. He set aside the day, the noun, right, the way that it was intended to. He set aside as holy. He set it aside as a day as unto the Lord. But he also interacted with it as the verb, as something to be practiced, as something to be, as a spiritual practice to be honed and taken seriously and to be looked at. So again, I think that means that we need to do the same. We need to interact with the Sabbath in the same way. So what does that look like? How do we practice that? I want to deal with the noun part first, all right? What we do with the day set aside as the Sabbath is important. It's important. Okay. I know for a lot of years, to be honest, I did not practice a Sabbath day. There was just too much to do, right? And it's not fair, by the way, and I'll probably talk about this a little bit more in just a moment as well. And it's not fair as well that like you all can actually make Sunday your Sabbath. This is hard work for me, by the way. Right? So it's not like, it's not like, oh yeah, this is very restful for me. No, this is not restful for me. Right? So, but there was so much that needed to be done on the other 6 days that you just couldn't find, I just didn't take a Sabbath. Right? Didn't feel it was important, but I have learned otherwise that it is very important. So for most of us, the Sabbath is on Sunday. And if we have followed Jesus' example of what that day, that noun of Sabbath is supposed to look like, it's the day that we should do exactly what we're doing now. That we should meet together, right? Jesus met together to learn and to teach and to come together with the community and to do those things. And that's what this is for. So we should meet to worship and to study and to learn. This is the moment when we gather with our community. Folks, you may not want to claim us, and that's okay, but I claim you. You're my community, right? You are a part of the group that holds me accountable to the things that I'm supposed to do. You're the ones that help motivate me to do the things that I'm supposed to do. You're the ones who motivate me to stay in the Word. You're just a part of that community that I need. Jesus didn't ignore those things. And we shouldn't either. And if you ignore them, you will find yourself, to be honest, you'll find yourself to be spiritually stunted in your growth. You're limiting yourself in, and I know I'm preaching to the choir because you're here. I get it, right? But still, when you come and you don't enter into it fully, right? Or you just decide it's really not that important. Because you've heard the people, I've heard the people that say, you know what, I don't have to go to church to be a Christian. They're absolutely right, and they're absolutely wrong, both at the same time. Because it's within that community that we really find strength, and we find challenge, and we find invitation, and we also find Sabbath. Just the way it is. Jesus didn't ignore those things, and neither should we. Again, Hebrews 10:25. I'm throwing these out. Hebrews 10:25. You can look it up. It encourages people, believers specifically, to gather together. It says, "Do not forsake yourself the gathering together of the saints." Right? Don't be a part of a community. Be a part of a church community. If you're good, basically it's this. If you're going to be a follower of Jesus, then you need to find a community that you're going to be a part of that's going to help you grow in your understanding of Jesus. That's the way I read Hebrews 10:25, by the way. Again, Jesus made it a point to go to the synagogue with his followers, right? It wasn't like, hey guys, you know what, I'm going to go to the synagogue, and so you guys just stay here. Now, there were times that he sent them ahead. I read about these sometimes. It's like sometimes he would send them to the synagogue. You guys go ahead. You guys go to the synagogue. You guys go to the temple, right? And then what he would do is he might go by himself, but he would follow behind, and he would just kind of go, so he would worship kind of by himself. But that was not his normal practice. Most of the time, he made it a point to go to the synagogue with his followers. And this is the part that blows my mind. I was just thinking about this one week while I was preparing this. Jesus went to the synagogue. Get this, okay, and try to understand it. Jesus went to the synagogue even though it was filled with hypocrites. I mean, the Pharisees, he didn't have much respect for them. I mean, he appreciated them, don't get me wrong, right? But it's kind of like, why? Why would you want to go hang out with those people? Right? They're the ones trying to trap you. They're the ones trying to do this. They're the ones who've been misleading people all these times. They're the ones who don't understand what it was back, what God gave to Moses clear back in Exodus that we talked about before. They're the ones who have distorted it and torn it apart and made it about them instead of God. They're the ones who did all these things. These are the people that every week would go to the synagogue, and Jesus went anyway. They were the ones that were teaching in the synagogues, and Jesus went anyway. So I'm telling you right now, you cannot use poor Christian behavior as an excuse to stay home. Don't let it stand in the way. Okay? I know. I get it. I get it. The church is full of hypocrites. I understand. I agree. I'm the chief hypocrite. I am. It's all right. But I'm just telling you that that's not a reason to not observe Sabbath. Not a reason. Okay? So just take that excuse off the table. What else do we see from Jesus? All right. The Sabbath is a day of contemplation, but it's also a day that's set aside to be in the presence of the Father. Right? As you look through what Jesus did, that's what he did. He went, right, and he thought about what it was that this word said, and what it was that the law was, and what it was that he came to do, and he thought about all those things. And the Sabbath was that day of contemplation, but it was also a day of rebreathing the Father. Renewing himself in the presence of the Father. Listen, I try to do those things. I mean, I hang out with hypocrites. I do. Just kidding. just kidding. But as I just said, right, for me, it's really difficult on Sundays to say Sunday is my Sabbath. I do a couple of things that help. Here's part of my confession. One of the things I do to help rest on Sundays, I nap. And I don't just nap. I just go back to bed, honestly, and for about an hour and a half. And I've done this and my kids all grew up with it, and they just know, just don't bother Dad on Sunday afternoon. Because unless there's something else keeping me from it, I'm just going back to bed. And I'm sleeping for a good hour and a half, maybe a little bit longer. Just depends, right? So, but that's refreshing, and I need that, right? The other thing that I do, people are like, man, well, you're pretty old to be going to 180, aren't you? It's like, yeah, I am. But one of the things that really brings me joy, and I don't want them to hear this because it might go right to their heads, but one of the things that really brings me joy is just sitting in the back, and I kind of enter into my own worship as they're leading the students in worship. And it's just very refreshing for me, right? To not have to lead and to not have to do anything, and just to be able to sit in the presence of the Father in the midst of that. Just, that's one of the things that helps me. And it kind of makes this a Sabbath as much as I possibly can make it one. But that's the physical part of Sabbath. So let's look at the action. I told you I got a lot to talk about. So let's look at the action of Sabbath, right? Which basically is to rest. Now it's a little trickier because it could be different for each of us. The action of Sabbath is more difficult for me, again, because technically I'm working, right? It's Sundays, again, they're stressful, they're exhausting. So I've made a different day my Sabbath. I try to make Fridays my Sabbath, right? I call it a day off, right? And so, and many of you know Fridays are my day off. And I try not to let anything intrude in that. Yes, I still get phone calls sometimes, and I'm an idiot. I answer those phone calls. But it doesn't matter, right? Right? There's certain things like somebody calls, like, can you do a funeral on this Friday? Sure, I can, right? If there's a wedding on a Saturday and we do a wedding rehearsal on a Friday, then yeah, I'm there, all those kind of things. Right? Just like your Sabbaths sometimes get interrupted, my Sabbaths sometimes get interrupted as well. Right? But I try to use Fridays as my Sabbath day. And my Sabbath might look different than some of the rest of you. I do projects around the house on my Sabbath. Oh, but that's work. Maybe. But we'll talk about that in just a minute, right? I often mow on Fridays. I don't really like to mow, with the exception of I don't have to think about anything else. And I put on, I put on my headphones and I've got 80s Jesus music playing, right? The good stuff. And as Keith Green, all those Rich Mullins, all those people going, right? I've got that running, and I try not to sing out loud as I'm mowing. Sometimes it gets a little bit carried away, and I probably do sing a little bit out loud. But right, I'm listening to what it is that God wants to say in the midst of that. We go visit our kids. We go visit our parents at different points. I try to do something different than I do the rest of the week. Maybe some of you have heard me repeat a quote. And I looked it up and I found out this quote actually originates with a guy named Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Right? I know, it's a great name. And he said this. He said, if you work with your hands, Sabbath with your mind. If you work with your mind, Sabbath with your hands. And over the years, I found that to be great help for me. Right? So I do things with my hands on my Sabbath because so much of the rest of my week is taken up with mental and emotional and interaction and all those kind of things. And so it's relaxing for me and restful for me and helpful for me to do something with my hands. And not only that, and I'm also going to let you in on a little pastoral secret right here. Not only that, but sometimes, and some of you will understand this, sometimes when you work with people, you never know if you're done. You just don't know if you're done. In fact, you aren't done. You're never done. And so I spend so much time working with people that it's like, I just want to see something concluded, right? By the way, funerals don't count. Okay, it's not what I'm talking about, right? But it's just like when you work on a project and it's like, that's done. And there's just a moment of restfulness in the midst of that where you can go, okay, I can breathe. And there's something for me that's helpful in defining Sabbath in doing that. I tell you all that because I think we get the impression that making the Sabbath day holy means that we can't do anything, right? But there's something about taking that one day that is holy and shifting it around to look at something different and to do something different that that allows you to set your mind and your heart in the presence of God. God made me semi skillful at some things, right? And it's good for me to use those things. So that's what I tried to do on my Sabbath day. And it's okay. I think it's okay. Just letting you know. So if you work with your hands all day, if that's your job all day long, is working with your hands and try to do it, if you're that person, which is great, then your Sabbath ought to look more restful, more about just letting God enter your mind and do those things. But if you work with your mind all day long, don't feel bad about on your Sabbath day doing a project and getting something done and allowing God's glory to be seen in the midst of that. Maybe I'm just making an excuse, and if I am, that's fine. I can live with that. But I want to go back to, just real quick, I want to go to Mark chapter 2. Okay, I told you I was going to return to this. Again, this is the version of the Matthew 12 thing that we talked about earlier. Again, so Jesus is walking through a grain field on the Sabbath, and the disciples start to pick the grain ahead, and they're cleaning them and eating them and observing, and those observing get all worked up because they're doing work, right? So then, what my point in this is verse 27. Right, they get all done. They kind of rake him over the coals and that kind of stuff. And then it says, 27 says, then he told them, those scoffers, the people that were against him. He says, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So then, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And we need to understand that phrase, because it's just like it's hard for us at times to understand it, but it's really a simple phrase. Again, the Sabbath was created for the benefit of all of us. Sabbath was created for your benefit, right? God just didn't say, listen, I'm going to make this day, and this day is mine, and nobody can do anything about it, and on and on. It wasn't like I'm going to create you all just so that you can come to this day and go, this is the most amazing day ever. It's like, no, I'm going to create this day so that this day can bring you peace, and this day can bring you rest. We need the rest, and it's important for our health. It's created for our benefit. God didn't create people so that the Sabbath would stand out as a special day. He didn't try to find a way to make one day different than all the others. He created a special day so that we could be prepared and trained to do holy things through the rest of the week. Again, I told you, I have way too much to cover. Just bear with me. I just want to revisit Sabbath and creation real quick. In the beginning, right, God created everything in 6 days. With me? Right? Okay, God created everything in 6 days. And then on the seventh day, what did he do? He rested. All right? Why wouldn't he? I mean, creating everything in 6 days had to be exhausting. Right? I don't think God gets exhausted, but in my head, I'm like, sure, that's enough for a week. I think you can do, you deserve just a moment. Right? So we follow suit. We work 6 days, and then we rest the seventh day. But what if, here's my question, what if the resting that God did wasn't because he was tired? What if he rested because he knew what was coming, and it would require the rest that he needed on that day? I read something that changed my perspective on the Sabbath. Read it several years ago. Actually, I was on sabbatical when I read it, and it changed my perspective on it. It says, too often we rest as a result of work. Instead, we should work out of our restfulness. In other words, turn things around. Instead of making Sabbath the day that we rest because we've worked so hard all week long, make Sabbath the day that you rest so that you're prepared for what is to come. See, two different things. One is Sabbath out of exhaustion. The other is Sabbath out of preparation and anticipation of what is to come. Make the Sabbath the first day, right? God always asks us to give the first fruits. So make the Sabbath the first day of the week that is to come rather than the last day of the week, so that you can rest up for what God has in store for you, because God has great things in store for you. And we miss it if we're exhausted. Sabbath should be in preparation of what is to come. Just food for thought. So here's the action. All I'm asking you to do this week is evaluate your Sabbath. Do you make the Sabbath a priority? Do you make it a priority to gather together with others on Sunday morning? Or is it just kind of like, you know what, if I have time, I'll be there. Otherwise, no. Is it a priority for you? Do you find time during your Sabbath day to get spiritually and physically recharged for the week that is to come? Or are you too exhausted to even think about what is to come? On the Sabbath, do you find time or do you make time to meet with the Father and rest in his presence? Or you just kind of go from one thing to the other and don't really think about it? Do you rest because you're exhausted from the week? Or do you rest so that you can face what's coming next? If you already do all those things, if you answered those things well, great. Continue to do it. If you didn't answer them so well, then change. Change your practices. Change your Sabbath routine. Change the way that you look at Sabbath. Find a moment to get away and reflect. Find a moment to listen and observe. Find a moment to breathe and think about what is ahead of you that God needs you to be ready for. Because the Sabbath is a holy day unto the Lord, a day of preparation. And that should be our practice. Father,
we hope that your life was enriched by today's word. If so, leave us a comment and let us know what stuck out to you today. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss any of our new content. Have a blessed day.